Good morning and welcome back to NPTEL online certification course on Indian poetry in English. You are being tuned into the lectures by Binod Mishra. Friends, if you remember well, in the previous lecture we talked about the poetic corpus of Arvind K. And in that connection, I had told you that Arvind K and Arvind K. Mehrotra were very good friends, and both of them were experimentalists. So, in this lecture, I am going to make you familiar with the works of Mehrotra. Now, there have been n number of writings on Arvind K. Mehrotra, and it is said that of all the poets, Arvind K. Mehrotra was one of the most true representative of contemporary Indian English poetry. You might be quite curious to know who was Arvind K. Mehrotra and what were the qualities in him that made him so popular, not only in India, but there was a time when he was also nominated for the position of Oxford professor. So, what are the main ingredients and what are the main qualities that make Arvind K. Mehrotra a living legend? We shall see in this lecture. As you might remember well that while we had been talking about Arvind K, we had said that the worldwide scenario had completely changed in the 1960s, and India also had witnessed a lot, because in post independent India, there were several challenges and we could not remain unaffected. So, there was also at one time a controversy about English, Angrezi Hatao, that was actually one slogan. And then in 1975, the clamping of the emergency that also stirred and that also disturbed many people in India. And it was at this time that many Indian poets who were actually writing, they also happened to be affected by these incidents. Now, the French surrealism of the 20s and the American beat poetry of the 1960s had a tremendous impact on Indian English poets. And not only Arvind K, but also Arvind K. Mehrotra was affected very much by this. Now, who is Arvind Mehrotra and what were the literary conditions? We had been discussing in every lecture that many of the Indian English poets, they actually came to the world of poetry through journalism and through the writers workshop. Fine. The international recognition of Commonwealth literature also added a flavor to it. So, it was in 1947, a year that was very significant for India, and it was also very significant for Arvind K. Mehrotra, because Arvind K. Mehrotra was born in 1947 and where? In Lahore. But he received his education in Allahabad at Allahabad University, and later on he also taught at Allahabad University for quite a good number of years, and he had been travelling, residing between Allahabad and Dehradun for quite a long time. He was at a time a visiting writer at the University of Iowa in US, and Mehrotra, as I said earlier, was nominated for the post of professor of poetry at the University of Oxford in 2009. It is actually said that Mehrotra's poetry is very much complex. While taking questions from many, Mehrotra once said, "Discovering the French and the American was for me a moment of liberation. My subjects did not lie in Europe or in United States, but I had first to make a detour to those places through their poetry to realize that my subjects lay nearer home if not at home." And you can find when you read the works of Mehrotra, you will find that Mehrotra was very particular about location, very much particular about location, and that is why majority of his poems have got a sort of grounding in his nearby places. It is often, one can often come across many reminiscences of his childhood. One can also come across many descriptions of his neighbors, the description of Mr. Roy in one of his poems, The Roys, the description of an Indian painter, the Sunday painter, fine, and he talks about common things. But what was so important about Mehrotra was he actually described himself not as an Indian poet writing a universal language of poetry, of feeling, of love, of hate and sex. So, not an Indian poet, he actually believed that he was not only an Indian poet, he was a poet who actually was writing a universal language of poetry that Mehrotra himself had admitted. And if you go into the poetic corpus of Mehrotra, you will find that Mehrotra really proved that. Mehrotra's poems are witty and sophisticated. When he, you must not be surprised that he started writing poetry only at the age of 19, and in 1966 he wrote one poem which was actually very much satiric. We will come to that poem also and see at that time what sort of reasoning did he have, how he was actually a follower of avant-garde literature, how he was actually trying to find fault with the new ways of the world, and how he wanted that poetry should not be closed, rather poetry should break free, how he was actually full of youthful rebellion and anarchy, and how he was also influenced and motivated by surrealistic acceptance of chance. So, there is a poetry of defiance, as we had been saying, that he was influenced by the beat movement as well. Mehrotra was not only a poet, but he was an anthologist, a critic, a translator and also a writer of many books of English literature's history, especially Indian English. One of his essays which became very popular, very famous is entitled "The Emperor Has No Clothes," in which he has actually taken a ride at Parthasarathi, one of his contemporary poets, and he has actually, Mehrotra has actually defended A.K. Ramanujan, fine, and if you get some time, please read that essay, which is very important from the understanding point of view of Mehrotra's world. In that Mehrotra says, if criticism has the health of the literary community in mind, its frame of reference should not be bound by a country's political boundary. Actually, A.K. Ramanujan was attacked and his poems were considered to be the anterior by Parthasarathi, and in that essay Mehrotra has actually defended A.K. Ramanujan and has talked about so many things. So, the essay is very interesting. Mehrotra considered English language as the best medium for contemporary poetry, and one can find that Mehrotra's world is not only full of wit, full of images, because Mehrotra was also a sort of surrealistic writer, and he was also an experimental. Two writers, two Indian English writers who actually deserve a lot of importance and should be mentioned are Arun Kolatkar and Arvind K. Mehrotra, apart from Dilip Chitra and Jayant Mahapatra. Mahapatra we have already read. Now, earlier influences in Mehrotra's world were of Andrew Breton, who was a surrealist and who was actually the propounder of this surrealism movement in art. And then another French poet, Apollinaire, and then Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot's influence was also very much on Mehrotra. Walt Whitman, because in the very first poem that Mehrotra has written, there he has made a mention of Walt Whitman. So, if Whitman were there, he could have also said the same thing. So, we will come to that poetry again and we will find that. Now, Bruce King in his very seminal book, what he says about Mehrotra is very important. He says, because Mehrotra was a postmodern poet and Mehrotra did not get satisfied, he was actually trying to discover a sort of language, and he said that language has to be free, and there, that is why time and again he polishes, he actually revises, so and he crafts, he actually wanted a sort of elegance and wit, precision and impersonality, which he says will fix the poem and the personal memories that are its source. So, Bruce King says that Mehrotra continually worries his perceptions, his relationships to his feelings and environment, often going over the same things from different angles. There are many poems that he has himself revised. A Mehrotra poem, here the line that the word that I am going to use has to be really underlined, is a construction. Mehrotra's poem is a construction, and he believes that the poem is not only, the poem is actually an object, and what is more important is the text. What is more important is the text. A Mehrotra poem is a construction, whereas a Mahapatra poem a deconstruction, meaning thereby in Mehrotra we can find that every now and then he experiments with lines, with words and with the depiction, and then the way he puts the words like an expert artist you will find when you come to see the very first poem at a very early age that he wrote. The poem was entitled Bharat Mata, but even before that Mehrotra had started, Mehrotra was such a person that he started his own journal in the beginning, and that journal did not get published, but then he himself became its publisher by cyclo-styling it. Damn you, it was a magazine of the arts, fine. So, in 1965 and in 1966 he wrote Bharat Mata, which is actually full of youthful exuberance of Mehrotra, where he delineates the picture, and there is a sarcastic remark as well, and it is a sort of parodying you will find. Then came the woodcuts on paper in 1967, then came Prisoner in 1968, and in 1970s Mehrotra, along with some of his friends, namely Adil Jashawala, G. Patel and Koladkar, they actually started one poetic venture or a publishing house entitled Clearing House, from which many of even Mehrotra's works also came out. So, one of his works entitled Poems, Poemas, that came out in 1971 from this Clearing House itself. Now, if we come to have a look at Mehrotra's poetic oeuvre, he has got 6 poetry collections to his name. He began with 9 enclosures in 1976, then came Distance in Statute Miles, Middle Earth, The Transfiguring Places, and then collected poems from 1969 to 2014, and then collected poems in 2016. And Mehrotra was a translator also, and he translated many other works. And then the 2 works, The Absent Traveller and Songs of Kabir, these are translations. He translated in Bengali, in Gujarati, and in some Prakrit language also he learned that. So, Bilas Sarang, another contemporary of Mehrotra, what he says about Mehrotra is quite pertinent, and he says, while the work of most Indian English poets seems to carry the stamp of British poetry, Mehrotra's poetry shows a kinship with American poets. That is why the beats, and then like Wallace Stevens in this respect, as also in spurning solemnity, he has been a liberating force. Look at the lines. He has been a liberating force in Indian English poetry. Now, why this liberating force? When we come to his very first poem, we will find how Mehrotra tries to liberate Indian English poetry from the clutches of imitation. Mehrotra's poetry may not be realistic. Mehrotra's poetry may appear to be very rebellious, but then Mehrotra was in search of a styleless poetry, which actually was going to be the representative poetic world of Mehrotra. Now, one can divide Mehrotra's poetic periods into 3 pages, beginning with a postmodern and avant-garde style that Mehrotra started in the beginning when he wrote this Bharat Mata poem, which many people have considered to be youthful exuberance. We can have a look at the lines, and then comes, since he was influenced by painters, So, we can also find an imprint of collage and cubist method of the French poet Apollinaire, and then also of Ezra Pound. But then the third stage, we can find a little bit of change in him, a precise recording of external reality. But let us have a look at Bharat Mata. The poem is very simple, but the poem is very sarcastic. Let us look at the lines in order to understand, because most of Mehrotra's poems are soaked in childhood joys. He goes to the past, he narrates, but then he is not without taking a dig at what was happening around him. India, my beloved country, ah, my motherland, you are in the world's slum, the laboratory, the septic tank wherein paper gutters fall, the marks, rubles, dollars, pounds, yens, liras, francs, yet our stomachs remain sirens tooting pathetic messages. I am so used to your cities with the chain reaction of suburbs, where whole families live in bathrooms and generations are pushed out of skylights, and the next one sticks out its head like a tapeworm through frozen sit, used to the village reduced to a bone and then swallowed. I am used to seeing the pot-bellied children ride the dog with jockey's confidence. At times it becomes very witty. The games of the children, which actually Parthasarthi says that in Mehrotra's world you can find a lot of gaming. And then as the poem proceeds, the sort of dig he takes, poetry is owned by the government, a project in the public sector. You see, poetry is owned by the government, a project in the public sector. Poetry sifts from the yellowing paper to the covers of a glossy weekly. Poetry goes to the tables and chairs, silence requested and ladies and families only. Poetry is kept in a hot house under the artificial ceiling and tube lights of the India coffee house. Poetry on the menu served with cutlets and politics. Poetry on posters framed in glass. Poetry for the people in. So, we can find here a sort of reaction, and this reaction, even though it is satiric, but it is subtle as well. But then Mehrotra is not going to continue with it, because he believes in a sort of freedom, and this freedom he not only vouches for, but then what he says, he takes a dig at the urban lifestyle and says, each house complete with refrigerator, transistor, telephone, car, record player, a newly married sofa set. See the dig, a newly married sofa set, Bursen lawn, aya, flowers, papaya trees, chili and tomato plants. So, he takes here a dig at the urban life as well, and when the poem comes to an end, he says Bharat Mata ki, and then he says Jai Hind, Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, whatsoever. Now, Mehrotra is such a poet that even though he appears to be very rebellious, but then he believes that a poem consists of images presented in juxtaposition. So, the later poems of Mehrotra, you will find that reality is juxtaposed, reality is not imitation, but then reality is actually turned, and turned in a way that there is no logicality, rather there is a sort of psychology involved into it. So, the characteristics of Mehrotra's poems are, Mehrotra actually creates his poetry out of disorder. Fine, his poetry comes out of disorder, that is why it may appear to be complex. Images are abundantly used. Poems, as I have been saying, they are surrealistic in nature, satiric they are, but then there is a radical construction, and this construction, which may appear at times very arbitrary, but then it is actually very willingly concrete, spatial and mechanical poetry Mehrotra writes, but then one cannot divest Mehrotra's world of the witty, precision and impersonal nature of his poetry. If you can have a look at the later poems of Mehrotra, you will rather find, if we take a poem entitled The Exquisite Corpse, look at the lines. Smoke makes faces, grey hair burns, children who don't play with me are taken away by jackals. So, there is a childlike imagination here. But then when we are composing poems of seriousness, Mehrotra is composing poetry which is witty, but which is soaked in satires, because we are living in a world which is full of illogic, which is full of reasoning, which is where there is loss, there is a sense of loss. Once a year I open my cellar, the old woman comes out of her shoe. Instead of hickory, I find a young genital. The goat's bleat has turned pink. Clouds of black stubble toughen the sky. In one of his poems, he says that the clouds have come to my room, fine, and they are actually barking, fine, and the disc is cracked. In one poem, he says that I brought a pigeon and sought it and kept it, fine, behind the cupboard. So many childhood reminiscences are there, and then he says, clouds of black stubble toughen the sky out of my father's cupboard, rich clusters of tiny walking sticks, the smell is of good manure. If you analyze this poem, you will find that his poems comprise games, as rightly said by Parthasarathi, riddles and accidents, and the poet creates, because he himself says that his poetry has so many accidents that he can create. According to Mehrotra himself, a poem consists of images in juxtaposition. So, you may not find the reality. There is a different sort of reality which is hidden, as we have been saying, the unconscious and the conscious being brought together to unlock the wisdom of the heart. Writing a line of verse, then passing over the paper to the next person as to the order of the things, my dear friend. There is another poem entitled Genealogy, where also he talks about his family, there he talks about the race and all. And there is once again another poem where he talks about his own India, from the Aryans to the Europeans. We can have a look at it. Let us have a look at the poem Genealogy, which is in 3 parts. It is a longer poem, but then some of the lines can always be read. I recognize my father's wooden skin, the sun in the west light ups his bald bones. I see his face and then his broken pair of shoes. His voice comes through an empty sleeve. Birds merge with blue like thin strokes. Each man is an unfinished fiction. You see, each man is an unfinished fiction, and I am the last survivor of what was our family. So, he talks about the family. And as it proceeds, my shadow falls on the sun, and the sun cannot reach my shadow. Near the central home of nomad and lean horse, I pick up a wheel, a migratory arrow, a numeral. The seed is still firms. Dreams pitch their tents along the rim. I climb Sugar Mountain. My mother is walking into the horizon. So, in a way, he is reminiscent of his own family members, but then as the poem proceeds, the poet says, fire breaks out in the nests, trees laden with the remnants of squirrels. You can find some images, and you can also go back and think of, are we really reading the wasteland? But it is not the wasteland, my dear friend, it is Mehrotra's land. Turn into scarecrows, the seed sends down another merciless root. My alembic distills these fairy tales, acids riddles the danger in flowers. I must never touch pollen or look into a watchmaker's shop at twilight. And the last section, which is very important, where what he says towards the end becomes very important. My journey has been this anchor, the off-white cliff a sail, fowl and dragons play near the shores, my sea-wrecked ancestors left. I call out to the raven and quote, my harem, my black rose, the clock slave, keeper of no man's land between us and court, and the raven, a tear hung above which massive people. And as it proceeds towards the end, he will say, to enter the rituals at the bottom of 12 seas, to enter the rituals at the bottom of 12 seas, unghost like voices curdled my blood, the color of my scorpion changed from scarlet to scarlet. I didn't mean to threaten you or disturb your peace, I know nothing of. It appears as if the poet is trying to find his own identity. And towards the end what he says, but you living in these fables, branches and somehow icebergs, tell me whose seed I carry. So, the poet appears to be very metaphysical here, but then poet interrogates and then there appears to be no logic, but then towards the end what he says is a very valid question, because he is a poet of the postmodern age, and he says, tell me whose seed I carry. Now, if we analyze this poem, we can find that even though the poet talks about the domesticity and the family, we have got a vestige of the racial and ancestral fantasy that the poet creates, and then it has been, it is a narrative, but there is a sort of parody involved in it. So, he parodies and sometimes he reminds us as if no, his father was like a king or whatsoever, but then there are recourses to fragmented allusions. There does not seem to be any sort of coherence as is true of the modern world, fine, and the entire poem is full of accumulation of images. Now, if we have a look at his world, we can really find, but before we come to wind up this lecture, we can find that Mehrotra is such a poet. Mehrotra is such a poet who actually tries to bring allusions in it. There is actually a sort of fragmentation as you might have witnessed, but then Mehrotra says that poetry cannot be linear. No, poetry cannot, it cannot be arranged in a manner that our people have been doing it, but poetry is somehow different, my dear friend. We can also find in many of his poems there are a parody of ready-made literary phrases. The construction appears to be arbitrary, fine, because Mehrotra believes that literature is artificial and it is not an imitation of reality. Rather it is somehow or the other different. In many poems, there have been many poems like the songs of the Ganga, where what the poet says is, I am the bridge, I am the fort and the archer, taking aim, I am the great dissolver of men. Here once again the poet says that many of us simply believes many of our aged values, but then we must also be ready to realize, like the Ganga, where through which the poet says, I am the great dissolver of men, I give life and I also take it back. My dear friends, we can also find that Mehrotra, being a postmodern poet, not only juxtaposes his material, but then it does not mean that Mehrotra's poetic volumes do not have that literary flavor. Mehrotra constructs language and he does not imitate reality. His allusions may appear to be very fragmented and he relies on collage and montage, because he was very much influenced by art and especially by the movement, by surrealistic movement. He focuses on the text and not on the history or society. Mehrotra's poems, because in many of his essays also he mentions that he actually attaches too much importance to particulars and he constructs order from images and allusions. We can also find an example when we say, while we have to sum up, I am the bridge. Look at the language. I am the bridge. He talks about the language and he does not believe that one language is important and the other is not, because he himself was familiar with so many languages and he had translated so many works. I am the fort and the archer taking aim, I am the great dissolver of men, I give life and I take it back. So, we can find Mehrotra's world which is based on many things, but Mehrotra does not confine him only to the set notions, rather he wanted poetry to be free, free from the closets. He wanted poetry to follow a sort of discourse, a sort of language. And in one more poem, in another poem entitled The Book of Commonplaces, he once again goes back to his childhood, and there he makes a mention of his own India, and he talks about the Aryan India and to the European, and he provides some very beautiful lines which we should not miss before we finally wind up this talk. My childhood wanders off into the family tree and the tree gets lost in the north. I am told we followed the tracks left by none in particular. The horse was an animal and once in the plains we settled among rivers. So, one can find Mehrotra's world, even though appearing to be very complex, but he was of the notion to create a sort of synergy between the conscious and the unconscious, so that the wisdom of the heart can be unlocked. I hope you will enjoy reading Mehrotra's poetic world and will lend your ears to understanding the beats, to understanding the lyrics and to understand the meaning, even though it is devoid of the sort of musicality in terms of the meter, but it has got a musicality of thought, and that is why Mehrotra is considered to be one of the most powerful voices of modern Indian English contemporary poetry. Thank you very much.